Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when dating was less about swiping right and more about whether your gloves match your parasol. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the days slow down as we step into the world of 19th century romance, which was less romantic than it sounds and more like a carefully managed business negotiation wrapped in lace. Let's begin somewhere in the early 1800s, when the idea of dating as we know it didn't really exist. There were no casual dinners, no let's grab coffee texts. Instead, there was courtship, slow, supervised, and governed by rules that made even Victorian furniture look casual. If you were a young woman of good family, meaning your parents had at least one respectable piece of land, and no major public scandals, you didn't go out and meet suitors by yourself. You were introduced by relatives, chaperoned at all times, and reminded regularly that your reputation could shatter like fine porcelain if you so much as smiled too warmly at the wrong person. And yes, they meant it literally. A warm smile could be considered too forward. The polite thing was to be, well, polite, neutral, almost unreadable. The ideal young woman was seen, but not too much, and heard even less. Naturally, this put enormous pressure on everyone to communicate deep romantic feelings through minor gestures, like dropping a handkerchief, or pausing slightly longer than usual while accepting a dance invitation. It was basically emotional Morse code, and everyone pretended to understand it. Men, of course, had their own rule book. A respectable gentleman was expected to demonstrate interest without being improper. He could call on a young woman at her home, but only during the appropriate hours, and usually with other family members present. Showing up unannounced was a terrible idea unless you were already courting, in which case it was only a slightly less terrible idea. If you stayed too long, it was rude. If you left too quickly, it was rude. If you brought flowers, they had to be the right kind, because every flower had a coded meaning. Red roses meant love. White roses meant purity. Yellow roses could mean jealousy or friendship or possibly, I'm confused but willing to commit. It depended who you asked. Let's pause here and appreciate how exhausting this must have been. Imagine trying to figure out whether the person you like was in love with you based on whether they sent violets or primroses. And imagine getting it wrong and accidentally thinking you were engaged because someone sent you orange blossoms. If that happened, your family might start preparing for a wedding before the poor man even knew he had proposed. Courtship was rarely private. Families often sat in the same room during visits, pretending not to eavesdrop while very obviously eavesdropping. This meant that suitors developed a talent for subtle conversation, or at least they tried. Much of courtship was about proving you had good breeding, good manners, and good prospects, which often translated into talking about the weather in a very impressive tone. And then there were the social events, balls, dinners, and garden parties, where couples could interact under watchful eyes. These events were designed to let young people meet, but not too freely. A dance card kept track of who you danced with, and if you danced too many times with the same person, it could be considered scandalous, which, honestly, was probably the most thrilling thing that happened all week. Now, let's drift a little deeper into the expectations placed on women. The perfect wife was supposed to be accomplished, which meant she could play the piano tolerably, paint some delicate watercolors, speak a little French, and, most importantly, remain calm at all times. She was to be cheerful but not silly, educated but not too clever, beautiful but in a way that didn't look like she was trying. Basically, she was supposed to be a living portrait of refinement. No pressure. Men, meanwhile, were expected to be providers, protectors, and moral examples, though, ironically, society gave them far more freedom to make mistakes. A man might spend his evenings at a gentleman's club, or even pursue a few indiscreet ventures, and people might shake their heads, but rarely did it destroy him socially. A woman, however, could be ruined by little more than a rumor, which seems unfair because it was, but fairness wasn't really the point of the 1800s. Let's also not forget the elaborate etiquette around letters. Handwritten notes were a central part of courtship. There were rules about how to fold a letter, how to seal it, what kind of paper to use. A perfumed letter might be considered romantic or too forward, depending on who you asked. A woman might spend hours writing a short reply, making sure her penmanship was graceful and her tone was perfectly balanced between interest and reserve. If you were courting in the 1800s, you also had to contend with the possibility of arranged matches, or at least strongly encouraged matches. Parents were deeply invested in who their children married, because marriage was not just about love, but about alliances, property, and status. Your heart might want one thing, but your family might have other plans, which, again, was considered perfectly normal. This is probably a good moment to ask, what would you have done? Would you have quietly followed all the rules, or found clever ways to sneak in a little rebellion? Tell me in the comments if you think you would have survived the endless dance cards and chaperones. And with that, let's drift onward, because we've only just scratched the surface of 19th century romance. Let's stay in the parlor a little longer, because that's where so much of the 19th century romance happened, or didn't happen, depending on who was sitting nearby with their embroidery and their opinions. Engagements were not just personal milestones. They were family events, public news, and sometimes social spectacles. If you were a young man who wanted to propose, you were not expected to simply take a walk in the park and pop the question under a nice tree. You were supposed to formally call at the young woman's home, often in your best suit, sometimes after negotiating the match with her father in advance. Romantic, right? You might be sitting across from her entire family, while trying to find the right words. The idea was to keep everything respectable, which meant it could also be intensely awkward. A successful proposal was followed by an official announcement in the newspaper. That's right. Your engagement would be printed for everyone to see, usually in a small column listing other engagements of the week. Imagine finding out your neighbor got engaged just by reading about it next to the shipping news. And once it was announced, backing out of the engagement was a serious matter. Breaking an engagement could damage not just reputations, but entire family relationships. There were even cases where lawsuits were filed for breach of promise, because yes, getting engaged was practically a legal contract. Courtship had to move at the right speed. Too fast. And people whispered that something improper must have happened. Too slow. And they started wondering what was wrong with you. Naturally, this led to a lot of subtle pressure, as relatives quietly nudged couples toward proposal. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it led to what was delicately called an unfortunate match. Let's talk about those. An unfortunate match might mean two people who simply didn't get along, but got married anyway, because it was convenient for their families. Divorce was rare and scandalous, so most couples stayed together no matter how unhappy they were. There are so many diaries and letters in the period that describe marriages filled with quiet misery, endless polite dinners, and the occasional passive-aggressive note left on a writing desk. And yet, there were love matches. They happened, sometimes against the odds. Occasionally, two people genuinely fell in love and managed to marry despite family objections, complicated finances, or mismatched social status. These stories were often romanticized in novels of the time because readers wanted to believe that love could triumph, even in a world full of chaperones and meddling aunts. Let's also remember that for women, marriage was often the main way to secure financial stability. In an era when respectable work options were limited, marrying well could mean the difference between a comfortable life and a precarious one. This doesn't mean women were passive. Many worked quietly but effectively to encourage the right match, sometimes using every bit of charm, wit, and strategic planning they had. Men were under pressure too, especially eldest sons who were expected to marry and produce heirs to keep the family name going. Younger sons had fewer options, which sometimes led to interesting compromises. A younger son might become a clergyman, join the military, or marry an heiress, if he could find one willing to overlook the fact that he had no title or estate. The engagement period itself was carefully managed. Couples could spend more time together, but were still expected to behave with perfect decorum. There are stories of engaged couples writing one another long, formal letters even while seeing each other regularly, because that was considered proper. Weddings, of course, were their own production. In the early 1800s, many weddings were relatively small, held in the parish church with just family and close friends attending. By the later part of the century, weddings became more elaborate, partly thanks to Queen Victoria, who popularized the white wedding dress and helped turn weddings into larger, more public celebrations. And through all of this, there was a constant hum of gossip. Who was courting whom? Who was secretly in love with whom? Who had been seen speaking too long at a ball? It all became part of the social conversation. Being the subject of gossip could ruin a reputation, but it could also make someone unexpectedly interesting. The line between scandal and intrigue was very thin, and everyone walked it carefully. Think about how different this is from today. Imagine if your engagement had to be publicly announced in a newspaper, and breaking it off might get you sued. Would you have survived the social pressure? Would you have been bold enough to follow your heart? Or would you have done what was expected and hope for the best? Tell me in the comments what kind of 19th century fiancé or fiancée you think you would have been. Let's drift onward now, because there's still plenty of romantic trouble waiting for us. And next, we're stepping into the surprisingly complicated world of 19th century flirting. Tonight, let's drift even further into the drawing rooms and candlelit corners of the 1800s, because it's time to talk about flirting, which, as we'll see, was not the freewheeling pastime you might imagine, but an art form governed by rules, social codes, and the very real threat of total social annihilation if you went too far. If you were a young woman in 1830, the very idea of flirting was a balancing act. You were expected to be charming enough to attract attention, but not so bold that anyone might think you were fast. And fast was not a compliment. It meant you had crossed some invisible line into scandal. The trick was to walk a tightrope where everyone could tell you were agreeable, modest, and marriageable, but also just faintly interesting. This often meant perfecting the skill of looking demure while secretly being very good at communicating with your eyes. Objects helped. Fans, gloves, parasols, even a dropped handkerchief could carry entire conversations. A woman could hide behind her fan and flutter at the right moment to signal interest, or lower it slowly to suggest she was flattered. Of course, this assumes that the man in question had read the same etiquette manual and knew what any of it meant. Miscommunication was common. A misplaced glance or an unintended gesture might lead to whispers, which could then spiral into weeks of speculation. Gloves were another major player in 19th century courtship. Gloves weren't just accessories. They were moral statements. Wearing gloves was a sign of propriety, and removing them at the wrong time could be considered downright suggestive. Imagine being at a ball and slowly taking off your gloves. It might seem innocent today, but back then it could be the equivalent of a wink that sent half the room into quiet shock. This is part why balls were such charged events. Dancing was one of the few socially acceptable ways unmarried men and women could touch, even if it was just briefly, fingertips against fingertips. A waltz with its close hold could be downright scandalous when it was first introduced. Some older chaperones considered it practically indecent because it brought couples within a shocking 12 inches of each other. Naturally, this meant young people loved it. But flirting wasn't just about playfulness. It was also a social skill that could make or break your future. A woman who flirted with too many men could be labeled a coquette, which might damage her reputation. A man who flirted too aggressively could be seen as dishonorable, and reputations mattered so much that one unwise evening could haunt you for years. The darker side of this was the constant fear of scandal. Scandal was a kind of slow-moving disaster. It could destroy a family's prospects if handled badly. A young woman seen walking alone with a man could be gossiped about for weeks. If the gossip grew loud enough, she might be forced into a hasty engagement just to preserve her honor, whether she actually wanted to marry the man or not. And yet, there was also thrill in this danger. Because the rules were so strict, bending them even a little felt daring. Whispering too long in a corner, exchanging a secret glance, sending a slightly forward note. These things could keep a whole household buzzing for days. Speaking of notes, let's talk about love letters. They were one of the few private ways couples could express themselves. But even letters were often intercepted, read, and sometimes judged by family members. Letters had to strike the right tone, not too cold, not too warm, which meant every sentence was an exercise in careful self-editing. Some young women kept drafts of their letters hidden away, just to make sure they got the wording exactly right before sending them. This leads us to one of my favorite aspects of 19th century flirting, the duel between sincerity and performance. Courtship was partly about genuine emotion, yes, but it was also about demonstrating that you knew the rules, that you could perform the correct ritual of affection. And sometimes, the ritual became more important than the feeling. A man might court a woman because it was expected, rather than because he was deeply in love. A woman might encourage a suitor not because she adored him, but because she needed to secure her future. Of course, this didn't always go smoothly. There are plenty of stories of disastrous proposals, awkward misunderstandings, and even scandals that started because someone misread the meaning of a dance or a fan signal. Imagine the horror of thinking a man was about to propose, only for him to simply wish you a pleasant afternoon and leave. Or worse, imagine thinking you were engaged because he kept calling at the house, only to discover he was actually interested in your cousin. Gossip about flirtations could ruin someone socially, but it could also elevate them. A slightly scandalous flirtation might make a woman the talk of the season, drawing more attention, as long as she managed to keep it just on the safe side of impropriety. This careful game of almost scandal became an art form for some, and it gave them a strange kind of power in a society where women often had very little. The irony of all this is that while society demanded chastity and modesty, it also depended on young people falling in love and marrying, which meant flirting was necessary, but also dangerous. It was like lighting a candle and then worrying about the fire, but keeping the candle lit anyway because you needed the light. Let's pause for a moment and ask, how would you have handled this? Would you have mastered the fan signals and glove etiquette, or would you have been caught breaking the rules? Tell me in the comments if you think you have been a perfect model of propriety or the talk of the town by spring. And now, let's drift a little deeper, because where there's flirting, there's scandal, and where there's scandal, there are reputations to be defended, duels to be fought, and sometimes entire family dramas to navigate. Let's settle a bit deeper into our armchair, because now we're entering the territory where 19th century romance stopped being polite tea time chatter and started becoming an actual problem. You see, in a society where so many things were about appearances, the threat of scandal hung over every courtship like a rain cloud. Scandal could arrive quietly, from something as small as a misplaced dance or a slightly too long carriage ride, and then spread until it was all anyone could talk about at the next dinner party. The problem with scandal was that it rarely stayed private. Gossip was the social media of the era, fast, relentless, and often inaccurate. A casual comment made in the morning could become an established truth by evening, embroidered with just enough detail to make it sound believable. If someone said they saw you walking with a gentleman, by the end of the week it might be widely known that you had promised to marry him. This is why reputation was everything. Families guarded their daughters' reputations the way we might guard passwords today. Carefully, anxiously, aware that one careless slip could change everything. A young woman who gained a reputation. And yes, they used the word just like that, with no qualifiers, might find herself excluded from invitations, whispered about in drawing rooms, or quietly removed from the marriage market altogether. When scandal did break out, there were a few ways to handle it. The first option was damage control, quietly arranging a real engagement, if possible, to legitimize whatever had happened. This is one reason why so many hasty marriages took place after rumors began. The logic was simple. If there's gossip about you and a man, marrying him would at least stop the gossip from being ruinous. It didn't always work, but it was something. The second option was denial, politely insisting that nothing improper had occurred and relying on the passage of time to make people forget. This sometimes worked, though it required everyone involved to keep perfectly calm and avoid further incidents. And then there was the most dramatic solution, the duel. Duels might sound like something out of a swashbuckling novel, but they were very real in the early 19th century. If a man's honor or a woman's was insulted, the men involved might end up meeting at dawn with pistols or swords to settle the matter. Of course, this was technically illegal in many places, but that didn't stop it from happening. Most duels were actually about reputation more than real romantic rivalry. If a man felt another man had insulted a lady's honor, he might feel compelled to challenge him, not necessarily because he wanted to fight, but because not doing so would make him look cowardly. Some duels were carefully staged to avoid real bloodshed. A shot fired into the air might be enough to satisfy honor, but others ended with serious injury, even death. It's worth pausing here to notice the irony. Society was obsessed with propriety, yet sometimes the only way to maintain propriety was to go stand in a field and try to shoot someone at sunrise. But scandals weren't just about love affairs or inappropriate glances. They could involve money, inheritances, or family secrets. Perhaps a gentleman's fortune was not as secure as it appeared. Perhaps someone discovered that a suitor had debts or an illegitimate child. Or, most dramatically, that he was already married. The shock of these revelations could ripple through an entire social circle, leaving everyone scrambling to distance themselves from the disgrace. And then there was a slow burn scandal, the kind that everyone knew about but politely pretended not to. A couple might live in quiet unhappiness, with a husband spending most of his time elsewhere and the wife retreating into her social duties, and everyone would simply agree not to mention it. Sometimes these situations became the subject of novels, slightly fictionalized, of course, because what is literature if not well-disguised gossip? All of this sounds dramatic, but in practice, much of it was experienced in a kind of low, constant tension, a background hum of what will people say, that shaped how everyone behaved, which is what makes reading about it now strangely fascinating. Imagine living under that kind of constant watch, where every move was measured and every slip could have consequences. And yet, even with all this, people still found ways to push the limits. Secret elopements were not unheard of, especially to places like Gretna Green in Scotland, where the laws were looser and young couples could marry without parental consent. These elopements were often thrilling and scandalous in equal measure, and they kept gossips busy for weeks. For every scandal that ended in ruin, there were others that eventually blew over, leaving everyone slightly wiser and slightly more careful. Because life had to go on, and next season's ball will bring a fresh round of potential matches, flirtations, and risks. So here's a general question for you to ponder before we drift onward. Would you have been the type to duel at dawn for someone's honor? Or would you have stayed in bed and let the gossip run its course? Tell me in the comments which approach you think you'd have taken, dramatic or diplomatic. Let's move softly onward now, because next we'll explore what happened after the courtship, after the engagement, after the wedding, when the reality of 19th century married life set in, with all its expectations, responsibilities, and its own unique set of quiet disasters. Now that we've survived the courtship, the engagement, and possibly even the duel at dawn, let's settle into married life, 19th century style. This is the part where romantic novels usually fade to black, but real life had a lot more to say. Marriage in the 1800s was not a casual undertaking. It was a merging of families, fortunes, and reputations. It was also a lifelong commitment, which meant that once you said, "I do," you were effectively stuck, for better, for worse, and sometimes for very awkward dinner conversations. The first thing to understand is that marriage was deeply practical. Love might have been part of it, if you were lucky, but it wasn't strictly required. Many marriages were arranged or at least strongly encouraged by families for reasons of money, status, or land. This meant that couples often had to get to know each other after they were already married, a process that could be either pleasantly surprising or deeply disappointing. Life after the wedding depended a lot on social class. Wealthy couples might have a large house or even several houses, a staff of servants, and plenty of space to avoid each other if necessary. Middle-class couples often lived more closely together, with fewer servants and more hands-on household management. In either case, running a household was considered the wife's primary responsibility, even if she had no practical experience. For a young bride, this could be overwhelming. Imagine going from being carefully chaperoned at your parents' home to suddenly being in charge of an entire household. Servants, meals, linens, everything. There were manuals written to help young wives manage their new responsibilities, full of advice on everything from keeping accounts to ordering coal for the fire. Some brides took to it naturally. Others struggled, which could lead to criticism from mothers-in-law who, of course, knew exactly how everything should be done. Then there were the expectations of behavior. A wife was supposed to be a model of respectability, calm, patient, and loyal. She was also supposed to be endlessly supportive of her husband, even if he was less than perfect. If a husband was neglectful, rude, or even unfaithful, society generally blamed the wife if the marriage was unhappy. She was expected to manage the situation gracefully and keep up appearances, no matter how she felt privately. Husbands, meanwhile, were expected to be providers and protectors, which often meant working long hours, traveling for business, or spending time in clubs or social organizations. Some were attentive and kind. Others were distant, leaving their wives to manage everything alone. Because divorce was so difficult and scandalous, couples were strongly encouraged to simply make it work, even if they were miserable. This led to what we might call the drawing room standoff. A husband might sit reading the newspaper while his wife worked on embroidery, both of them sitting in polite silence, each privately wondering how their lives had turned out this way. Some couples eventually developed a kind of quiet companionship. Others spent decades merely tolerating each other. Married life also came with the expectation of children, and lots of them. Large families were common, and having an heir was considered crucial, especially for aristocratic couples. This put enormous pressure on women, whose health could suffer after repeated pregnancies. Infant mortality was tragically high, meaning families often faced loss as part of everyday life. But not every aspect of 19th century marriage was grim. Many couples did build strong partnerships, sharing responsibilities and growing closer over time. There are charming letters between husbands and wives that show real affection, even humor. Some couples genuinely enjoyed each other's company, managing to create small pockets of happiness despite society's constraints. There was also a whole culture of visiting and entertaining that gave married couples a steady rhythm of social life. They hosted dinners, attended balls, went to theater, and exchanged endless calling cards. This helped fill the long days and provided plenty of opportunity for observing and occasionally judging everyone else's marriages. Naturally, there were also scandals within marriage. Affairs happened, though they were handled with varying degrees of discretion. Some wives looked the other way, preferring to avoid public humiliation. Others quietly separated from their husbands, living apart while remaining legally married. And a few made headlines by filing for divorce, which was rare enough to be considered shocking. All of this created a strange mix of stability and tension. On one hand, marriage provided structure, financial security, and social respectability. On the other, it could feel like a very polite cage. Couples who got along made the best of it. Couples who didn't, well, they became excellent subjects for gossip. If you picture yourself in this world, what do you think you'd do? Would you thrive as a capable mistress or master of a grand house? Or would you find yourself secretly plotting an escape to Gretna Green? Even after the wedding? Tell me in the comments what kind of 19th century spouse you think you'd have been. Let's drift onward now, because married life was only the beginning. Next, we'll step into the drawing rooms and nurseries of the Victorian world to explore how children were raised, educated, and occasionally traumatized by their very ambitious parents. Now that we've survived courtship, marriage, and the quiet negotiation of drawing room life, let's wander down the hallway into the nursery, the heart of 19th century family drama. If there's one thing you notice when looking at portraits of children from this era, it's how serious they all look. No bright smiles, no cheerful chaos, just solemn little faces staring into middle distance, like they already understood taxes. Part of this was a photography process. Of course. Early photographs required long exposure times, which meant sitting very still. No one's going to hold a smile for 45 seconds without looking a little haunted. But part of it was simply cultural. Childhood in the 1800s was not treated as a free-spirited time of self-expression. It was seen as preparation for adulthood, and preparation began early. The nursery was a carefully managed space. If you were wealthy, you were mostly raised by a nurse or a governess, with parents dropping in at scheduled times. A good governess was supposed to be firm but kind, educating children in reading, writing, arithmetic, and, most importantly, good manners. A bad governess could be too strict, too lax, or simply strange, which could leave a lasting impression on young minds. Children were expected to be obedient and polite, almost to the point of invisibility. The idea of children should be seen and not heard was more than just a saying, it was a household rule. Speaking out of turn, making noise in the drawing room, or generally being inconvenient could result in punishment. Discipline could range from stern lectures to physical punishment, depending on the family. Education was central to childhood, but it varied by class and gender. Boys were often sent away to boarding schools, where they endured a mix of Latin lessons, cold baths, and a hierarchy of older boys who sometimes made life miserable. The idea was to build character, though in reality, it also built a lifetime's worth of mildly traumatic anecdotes. Girls were usually educated at home, taught by governesses, or sent to finishing schools to learn accomplishments rather than rigorous academics. Accomplishments were a particular obsession for young ladies. They were expected to play the piano, sing, draw, and perhaps speak a little French, just enough to seem cultured, but never enough to be intimidating. The point was not to produce a great artist, but to create someone pleasant to have in a parlor. Playtime existed, but even play was often designed to be educational or improving. Toys might include miniature tea sets, dolls, wooden animals, or puzzles. Outdoor games like hoops, skipping ropes, and battledore and shuttlecock were popular, but children were still expected to behave with decorum. Getting too dirty, too loud, or too wild could result in being called inside for a lecture. And then there were clothes. Children's clothing in the 1800s was a kind of training ground for adult fashion. Young boys might wear dresses until a certain age, then transition into short trousers and a milestone called breeching. Girls wore dresses that gradually became more restrictive as they grew older, until they too were fitted into corsets as teenagers. Imagine being 6 years old and already practicing standing up straight, because your future spine was everyone's concern. Despite all the seriousness, childhood could still have its joys. There were birthday parties, Christmas celebrations, and the occasional treat of a trip to the seaside. Family letters sometimes described children playing games in the garden or putting on little performances for their parents. And siblings could be close companions, sharing secrets and adventures in between lessons and formal meals. But there was also a shadow over childhood that we can't ignore: illness. Medical care in the 1800s was limited, and childhood diseases could be deadly. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria claimed many young lives, and parents lived with the constant worry that one bad winter might take a child from them. This gave childhood a bittersweet quality. It was cherished, but it was also fragile. Parental involvement varied. Some parents were deeply affectionate and involved in their children's lives. Others were more distant, believing that too much indulgence would spoil a child. Letters from the period reveal everything from warm encouragement to very stern moralizing, often in the same paragraph. And of course, there was the issue of inheritance. For aristocratic families, having a son, preferably the first son, was crucial. Daughters were loved, but they were also considered future wives for someone else's family, which made sons a main focus of dynastic planning. This pressure could create high expectations for boys, who were raised from birth to understand that they were not just children but heirs to a legacy. This mix of affection, pressure, and formality produced some very interesting adults. Some grew up to be capable and dutiful pillars of society. Others grew up to write scathing memoirs about their governesses. And a few probably never recovered from the trauma of cold porridge at boarding school. So, let's pause here and imagine yourself as a 19th century child. Would you have thrived under strict rules and careful routines? Or would you have been the one sneaking jam tarts out of the pantry and getting caught? Tell me in the comments whether you think you'd have been the perfect model child or a small but determined rebel. Let's drift onward now, because those serious little children eventually grew up, and their adulthood brought with it a whole new set of challenges, including careers, politics, and the occasional spectacular public meltdown. So, you've made it through a 19th century childhood. You survived the governess, the Latin lessons, the scratchy collars, and the boarding school hierarchy. Now you are considered an adult, or at least adult enough to be presented to society, which was a formal way of saying, look, we have a new person ready for marriage negotiations. For young men, adulthood often meant a new suit a firm handshake, and an unspoken expectation that they would join one of three acceptable career paths: politics, the military, or the church. Each came with its own version of prestige and social headaches. Politics could be dull, the military could be dangerous, and the church could be suffocating. But all three were considered respectable ways to pass one's time while waiting to inherit an estate. Many aristocratic young men were sent into Parliament, often with very little interest in lawmaking. Some barely showed up for votes, but were still technically members of Parliament. Others threw themselves into political life and became great reformers. But let's be honest, many were there because someone in the family thought it would look good on paper. The military was another favored route. This wasn't always a path of glory. In fact, in peacetime it could be surprisingly quiet. Many young officers spent their time attending balls, organizing regimental dinners, and occasionally drilling troops who were just as bored as they were. The uniform was a powerful social accessory, and it opened doors to drawing rooms where mothers were hoping to find husbands for their daughters. The church offered a different kind of career, usually for younger sons who wouldn't inherit anything substantial. Being a clergyman in the 19th century could be a comfortable post if you had a decent parish and a steady income. Some clergymen were genuinely pious. Others treated the job as an easy way to stay near family, read books, and host pleasant dinners. And then there were those who did nothing at all, at least in the conventional sense. These were the professional loungers, the men who lived off rents from their estates and spent most of their time hunting, fishing, and attending social events. In some cases, this life of leisure was considered an achievement. It meant you had enough money to avoid working. For women, adulthood meant something quite different. After being brought out into society, their primary career path was marriage. If they succeeded in finding a suitable husband, they became the lady of a household, managing servants, planning social events, and raising children. If they did not marry, they might become companions to relatives, governesses, or dedicate themselves to charitable works. Marriage could be a full-time occupation. There were household accounts to manage, endless correspondence to keep up with, and the task of supervising staff who might number in the dozens. A capable lady of the house was part manager, part diplomat, and part social strategist, ensuring that her home remained respectable and that her children were well positioned for future matches. For those outside the aristocracy, adulthood often meant actual labor. Middle-class men might go into business, law, or medicine. Middle-class women might help run a family shop, teach, or, if money was very tight, enter service. Working-class men and women often started working in factories or on farms as teenagers and simply kept working until they couldn't anymore, but were mostly lingering in the world of the privileged, where adulthood came with both freedom and a peculiar kind of pressure. You were expected to marry well, behave well, and keep the family name polished and untarnished. Any scandal could ripple through the social circles and become the talk of the next season. Adulthood was also a time for hobbies, and the Victorians were very good at hobbies. Collecting things was practically a competitive sport. Shells, stamps, butterflies, fossils, you name it. Someone was cataloging it in a very earnest notebook. Men joined clubs devoted to everything from science to yachting, while women might take up watercolors or embroidery. Of course, some people ignored expectations entirely. There were aristocrats who gambled away fortunes, refused to marry, or ran off with entirely unsuitable partners. Others took up eccentric projects, like building massive, impractical houses or sponsoring bizarre scientific experiments. These were the people who kept gossip columns in business. And then there was travel. If you had the means, you might take a grand tour of Europe, visiting ancient ruins, art galleries, and fashionable resorts. Travel could be educational, but it could also be an excuse to buy souvenirs and eat too much gelato in Rome. It was considered an important part of a gentleman's education, though one suspects some gentlemen learned more about wine lists than history. For those who inherited titles, adulthood came with ceremonial duties. There might be tenants to deal with, political alliances to maintain, and family squabbles to mediate. Some took these responsibilities seriously. Others preferred to leave it all to their estate managers while they enjoyed the London season. Let's pause here for a quiet moment of self-reflection. If you were an adult in the 19th century, which path do you think you'd take? Would you throw yourself into Parliament, join the army just for the uniform, or try to live quietly on a country estate with a good library? Tell me in the comments which life you'd choose, or if you'd rather just stay in bed and avoid society altogether. Let's drift onward now, because adulthood eventually leads to middle age, and middle age in the 19th century came a whole new set of rules, ailments, and the occasional midlife crisis expressed through questionable facial hair choices. So, you've grown up, settled into adulthood, maybe married, maybe inherited a house full of portraits staring at you from the walls. Congratulations! You are now middle-aged in the 19th century. This was the stage of life when people began to take health very seriously. Or perhaps more accurately, they began to worry about health very seriously. Middle age was a turning point. People started to think more about mortality. And given the medical options available, there was plenty to worry about. Life expectancy was shorter than today. Though if you survived childhood and avoided major infections, you had a decent chance of living into your 60s or 70s. Still, the idea of good health became something of a personal mission. One of the great 19th century obsessions was digestion. The Victorians truly believed that most of life's problems could be traced to the stomach. A bad mood? Probably indigestion. Melancholy? Something you ate. Nervousness? Clearly the fault of a sluggish liver. This led to a booming industry of patent medicines promising to cleanse, restore, and invigorate the digestive system. These medicines came in brightly labeled bottles and were sold over the counter with extravagant claims. Some contained herbs, some contained alcohol, and some contained substances that would absolutely horrify a modern pharmacist. Laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium, was one of the era's most popular remedies and was taken for everything from headaches to insomnia. People didn't just sip it occasionally. They sometimes relied on it daily, which, as you might guess, led to a fair amount of quiet addiction. Another popular approach to health was hydrotherapy, taking the waters. This meant visiting spas and bathhouses where you could soak in mineral springs, drink dubious-tasting water, or have yourself sprayed with jets of cold water in the belief that it would restore vitality. Some of these treatments probably did have mild benefits, if only because they encouraged rest and fresh air. Others were basically elaborate ways of getting very wet and very uncomfortable. Exercise became a subject of interest, too. For men, riding, fencing, and walking were considered excellent ways to stay in shape. Gymnastics clubs began to appear, though they were nothing like today's gyms. Think parallel bars and rings, not treadmills. For women, gentle calisthenics and walking were encouraged, but anything that caused too much exertion was frowned upon, lest it be considered unladylike. Diets were another area of experimentation. Some advocated eating plain, simple foods to avoid overstimulating the senses. Others promoted vegetarianism, which was seen as a radical but increasingly popular choice among health reformers. There were endless debates about whether meat was invigorating or dangerous, whether tea was a blessing or a vice, and whether coffee was a stimulant that would lead to moral ruin. Middle age also brought with it fascination with tonics. Tonic water, fortified wines, bitters, and cod liver oil were all part of the routine. Some tonics were harmless, some were mildly helpful, and others were basically flavored alcohol marketed as medicine, which, to be fair, probably made most patients feel better temporarily. Let's not forget the health gadgets. The Victorians loved a good invention, and the market was full of curious contraptions designed to improve circulation, straighten posture, or cure nervous disorders. There were vibrating chairs, electric belts, and mechanical exercise devices that promised to shake the weight right off. It was all very scientific looking, though results were mixed at best. Doctors themselves ranged from brilliant pioneers to enthusiastic guessers. This was an era of rapid medical advancement, but also of wild experimentation. Anesthesia and antiseptics were becoming more common, which made surgery far safer than before, though the idea of willingly visiting a hospital still terrified many people. Home remedies and folk cures remained popular, partly because they felt more familiar and partly because they were cheaper. Mental health was not well understood, but it was beginning to be studied. Unfortunately, the treatments often involved rest cures that essentially confined patients to bed, or visits to asylums where conditions were far from ideal. Nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, became a fashionable diagnosis for the stressed middle and upper classes, leading to a boom in spa retreats designed to calm the nerves. Social life in middle age often centered around dinners, clubs, and charitable work. For men, clubs were an important part of the routine, places where they could read newspapers, play billiards, and have long conversations about politics while avoiding domestic chaos. For women, charity work was both a duty and a social outlet, whether it meant visiting the poor, fundraising for hospitals, or hosting sewing circles. There was also the subtle onset of midlife crisis, though it looked different than today. Men might grow dramatic whiskers, buy faster horses, or invest in risky business ventures. Women might throw themselves into artistic projects, religious devotion, or elaborate redecorating schemes. Everyone seemed to feel the need to prove they were still vital, still relevant, and not just sliding gently into old age. It's worth noting that fashion still played a role. Middle-aged men might trade in tight trousers for looser cuts, but they still kept up appearances. Middle-aged women had to balance looking dignified with still being stylish, and heaven forbid they dressed too young for their age. As you settle into this image of 19th century middle age, ask yourself, would you have been the kind of person to try every new tonic and gadget, or would you have quietly avoided the latest health craze and hope for the best? Tell me in the comments which camp you'd fall into, the adventurous early adopter or the cautious skeptic. And now, let's drift onward toward the next stage of life, because eventually, even the most enthusiastic spa-goers had to face old age, inheritance battles, and the possibility of leaving their grand estates to heirs who might promptly ruin everything. You survived childhood, navigated adulthood, endured middle age with all its tonics and hydrotherapy. Now you've arrived at the twilight years of 19th century life. Old age was treated with a mix of reverence, inconvenience, and mild terror. You were expected to be wise, dignified, and perhaps just a little bit cranky. But above all, you were expected to keep the family name intact until you passed it on. If you were fortunate, you lived to see your grandchildren, perhaps even great-grandchildren, and could sit at the head of the table dispensing advice no one wanted but everyone politely listened to. Old age was considered a blessing, though it came with its own list of challenges. Rheumatism was practically a badge of honor. Poor eyesight was common, and everyone seemed to talk about digestion even more than they did in middle age. One of the main duties of the elderly was managing inheritance. This could be surprisingly complicated. Estates had to be passed down legally, and wills had to be carefully drafted. A poorly written will could cause a scandal that would ripple through society for years. If you had multiple children, you had to decide who got what, and naturally, someone was bound to be disappointed. Primogeniture, the practice of leaving the main estate to the eldest son, was still very much the norm in many aristocratic families. This kept estates intact, but often left younger children scrambling for careers or advantageous marriages. The daughters might receive dowries, and the younger sons might be packed off to the army, the navy, or the church with a small allowance. Sometimes, however, the eldest son was not exactly an ideal heir. Letters from the time are full of quiet complaints about heirs who gambled too much, drank too much, or simply seemed incapable of managing anything larger than a small dinner party. Parents faced the difficult choice of hoping their heir grew out of it, or rewriting their wills in favor of a more sensible relative, which could cause absolute uproar when the news broke. Old age also meant the slow transfer of authority. A father might gradually hand over management of the estate to his son, though not always gracefully. Some clung to power until the very end, causing friction as the younger generation tried to modernize things. And if there was no direct heir, the process could get messy very quickly, with cousins, nephews, and distant relatives all making their case. There were also cases where fortunes were left to complete strangers, eccentric friends, or beloved servants. These were the scandals people loved to gossip about. The shocking will that left a country house to the butler, or the fortune that went to a companion instead of the family. The newspapers loved these cases too, often reporting them with just enough detail to keep everyone whispering over tea. For those without large estates, old age was quieter but not always easier. Pensions were rare, so many relied on family support. Some elderly women became permanent house guests of their married children, a situation that could be harmonious or awkward depending on personalities. Letters from a period reveal both gratitude and exasperation about this arrangement. Health care for the elderly was limited, though advances were slowly improving things. There were spectacles for failing eyesight, canes for walking, and an array of liniments, poultices, and herbal teas for aches and pains. Doctors recommended fresh air, gentle exercise, and warm flannel clothing. The concept of retirement as we know it today didn't really exist. You simply slowed down until you could no longer do much at all. Socially, older people were often expected to take on the role of moral guide, offering advice and setting a good example. Grandmothers were pillars of domestic wisdom, passing down recipes, household tips, and firm opinions about everyone's life choices. Grandfathers told stories about the old days, usually with some embellishment, and sometimes provided helpful lectures about how everything had been better before the railway ruined the countryside. But let's not pretend old age was always peaceful. Family disputes could flare up over money, property, or even sentimental objects. Letters survive of siblings falling out over a single piece of jewelry or a favorite portrait. These quarrels could last for years and occasionally ended up in court, providing endless entertainment for the wider community. You've made it this far in life, and now it's time to dress up. If you were part of the upper crust in the 19th century, you couldn't avoid the season, a whirlwind of dinners, calls, garden parties, and, most importantly, balls. The social season was both dazzling and exhausting, a kind of marathon where the goal was to see and be seen without committing any serious faux pas. The season usually began in spring and lasted through early summer, coinciding with Parliament, so that the political elite and fashionable crowd were all in London at once. Families would move from their country estates to their London houses, dust off their silk gowns, and prepare for months of social duty. Balls were the crown jewel of the season. Invitations were coveted, and the right ones could secure your place in society for years to come. A successful ball involved flowers, candles, an orchestra, an excellent supper, and, ideally, a marriage or two arranged quietly in a corner. Guests were expected to dance, and to know the dances. If you were unfamiliar with the quadrille, the waltz, or the polka, you risked standing awkwardly on the sidelines, which was almost worse than not being invited at all. Dance cards were an essential accessory, allowing ladies to write down which gentlemen had claimed which dances. Forgetting to ask a lady to dance was a social misstep. Asking too many times might look suspiciously like courting. Everything had to be balanced, choreographed, and performed with a kind of graceful restraint. Outside of balls, there were dinner parties, which could range from intimate gatherings to elaborate affairs with multiple courses. Conversation was carefully managed. Politics could be discussed but never too heatedly, and religion was approached with caution unless everyone present agreed on the topic. Complimenting the hostess was mandatory. Complaining about the food was unthinkable, even if the aspic was wobbly enough to look slightly haunted. There were also morning calls, which involved visiting friends and acquaintances during very specific hours, and leaving a calling card with your name beautifully engraved on it. These cards were the 19th century equivalent of social media. They signaled who was in town, who was making an effort, and who would snub whom by not returning a call. For those new to the season, it could be overwhelming. Young debutantes were introduced to society, sometimes literally presented at court to the queen. This was meant to signal that they were now ready for marriage, essentially the world's most formal coming-out party. The pressure to look elegant, behave perfectly, and perhaps catch the eye of a promising suitor was immense. And then there were the scandals. With so many people gathered in one city, gossip spread quickly. A dress worn twice in 1 week, a dance declined too sharply, or a gentleman seen too often with the wrong lady could ignite weeks of quiet murmurs. Everyone wanted to be noticed, but not for the wrong reason. If you imagine yourself here, under the chandeliers, would you be dancing every set or quietly slipping out early with a headache excuse? Tell me in the comments whether you'd embrace the season or avoid it entirely and retreat to the country with a good book. Let's drift onward, because beyond the glittering ballrooms lay the less glamorous side of life. Scandals, duels, and the little dramas that gave 19th century gossip its sparkle. The 1800s were full of moments when carefully constructed lives unraveled in full view of society. Scandal was a powerful word then, and it didn't take much to earn it. A letter gone astray, an overheard conversation, a slightly too public argument, all could become fodder for the local paper and the relentless rumor mill. Sometimes it was financial misfortune. Estates were expensive to maintain, and one bad harvest, one reckless investment, or one unlucky gamble could send a family spiraling into debt. Selling off a country estate was practically a public humiliation. The neighbors would know, and they would talk, and the family crest would suddenly seem a little tarnished. There were also personal scandals, broken engagements, marriages that dissolved into public bitterness, heirs who behaved badly. A duel might settle a matter of honor, but it could also leave one family short a son, and the other dealing with uncomfortable questions about whether the whole affair had been worth it. Women faced even harsher judgment. A young lady caught in a compromising situation could find her entire future rearranged within days. A hasty marriage, a sudden trip abroad, or a quiet life of permanent spinsterhood. Letters showed just how far families would go to suppress scandal, from bribing servants to buying silence from witnesses. But life did not stop for misfortune. People found ways to carry on. A scandal might be lived down eventually, provided no one made it worse by talking too much. Some even turned their misfortunes into something respectable. A widow might reinvent herself as a great philanthropist. A ruined family might produce a child who became a celebrated writer, turning their downfall into material for everyone to read. You can almost hear the hushed voices at tea tables, the rustle of newspapers reporting on who had fallen from grace this week. And perhaps you might think, what would you have done in their place? Would you have tried to keep up appearances, or simply embrace the drama and given society something to really talk about? Let's wander softly toward the last act, because after scandal came the slow settling of life's dust and eventually the quiet curtain of time. The 1800s had a distinct way of saying goodbye. Mourning was practically a full-time occupation. If you lost someone, you wore black for months, sometimes years, and were expected to speak of the departed with solemn dignity, even if they had been utterly impossible in life. Funerals were often elaborate affairs, complete with velvet-draped coffins, slow processions, and carefully written eulogies. Tombstones became increasingly decorative, with angels, urns, and weeping willows carved into the stone. Family plots grew crowded, a quiet reminder of generations gone by. Those who lived on were left with the task of keeping memory alive, through portraits on the wall, letters tied with ribbon, and carefully guarded family stories. Estates passed hands, names were added to family Bibles, and the cycle of life continued. For some, old age was peaceful, a slow winding down in a favorite chair by the fire. For others, it was lonely, with too many absences at the dinner table and too many empty rooms in the house. But there was also a quiet dignity in simply enduring, in watching new generations grow, and knowing that life went on. You might picture yourself walking slowly through the long gallery of a country house, portraits of ancestors gazing down, dust motes floating in the late afternoon sun. There is something comforting about that stillness, the sense that while lives may have been messy, they have all become part of a larger story. Tell me in the comments, if you could step into this world for one day, which part would you choose? A ball, a country dinner, a quiet fireside evening, or perhaps a scandalous whisper over tea? Thank you for drifting through this long, slow journey into the 1800s with me tonight. We've walked through childhood, courtship, scandal, and old age together, and maybe discovered that surviving a single day in that century would have been quite the challenge. If you enjoyed this calm dive into history, I'd love it if you'd give this video a quiet like, maybe share it with a friend who loves slow history, and subscribe for more late-night historical rambles. And before you drift off completely, tell me in the comments, which century would you actually choose to visit if you could? The 1800s with their dancing and gossip? The medieval world with its castles and cloisters? Or perhaps you just stay right here in the present, where at least you don't need 3 separate pairs of gloves for the social season. Good night and sleep well.